May 10th is our last day of school.
May 11th is the day we're gonna quiz over this.
No.
So when there isn't enough tax revenue and the government's spending too much, they can print extra money. Almost every hyperinflation in history has started from this cause. Okay? The revenue that they get when they print the money we refer to as an inflation tax, because printing money causes inflation, which is essentially a tax on everybody who holds money, meaning you're taxed by the amount of the inflation because you lose that percentage of purchasing power. Anybody want to guess what our current inflation tax is in the U.S.?
1.5%.
In that neighborhood.
Is that included in like sales tax? It's like different.
It's because it's not an actual tax. It's not a legislative tax. It's just a loss of value that occurs because of the printing money. So we refer to it as the inflation tax. All kinds of vocabulary in this chapter already, right?
Maybe one or two.
The Fisher effect.
How about the Hunter effect?
It's Friday, Andrew.
It's Friday, my dudes. Like the broke, my dudes.
So if the nominal interest rate is the inflation rate plus the real interest rate. So wait a minute. Didn't we used to say that the real interest rate is nominal plus or minus inflation? Right? Assuming inflation is positive, then we subtract it. So you just take that equation and turn it inside out. And this works where the real interest rate is determined by how much investment is going on in the loanable funds market. So how much is going into that market, because that's where that interest rate is set based on supply and demand. I feel like you guys are having a hard time holding prior chapters in your brains and linking this stuff together sometimes. That's what happens when you just cram it for a quiz and don't actually learn it. We know that it is the growth of the money supply that causes inflation, so this shows us how we end up with what our nominal or now interest rate is. This makes very logical sense if you understand that we as consumers and savers affect the real interest rate, and that the Fed, through the money supply, affects the inflation rate.
So by the federal government increasing the interest rate, does that increase the money supply?
No, they are increasing the federal funds rate, which is the money that they lend to banks.
And that creates inflation?
No, that makes borrowing more expensive because banks now have to pay the Fed a higher amount when they borrow money from the Fed. So that means they're going to charge you more money when you borrow money from the bank. So that makes borrowing money more expensive.
It stops.
What stops?
That means
Stops investment, right?
it decreases.
Which is the loanable funds market. So they're just coming at it from the backside. Yeah, the Federal Reserve has two arrows in their quiver, as it were. They have monetary policy where they affect the money supply by printing more money or by buying or selling bonds. And then they have interest rate, which is how they affect the loanable funds market by raising or lowering the federal funds rate. in fiscal policy, which is what Congress controls, they have two arrows in their quiver. They have tax and they have spend. Alright. If we know that money is neutral in the long run, and I think we established that pretty clearly yesterday, even in spite of our quicksand, right? We know that a change in the money growth rate affects the inflation rate, but not the real interest rate. So we know that the inflation rate is always a change in the inflation rate is always going to impact the nominal interest rate. 1 for 1. Fisher. He did not win a Nobel Prize for figuring this out.
But you're on that. You don't remember the urinal fly?
But that wasn't about the urinal fly. It was about studying human behavior and its predictability
But in the urinal.
and incentives.
Oh yeah, I knew all about that. I knew all about that. Sarcasm.
You had to read an article and comment on it first semester.
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
The urinal fly.
I probably read it, but I don't remember it.
Did you know?
All right.
You saw it.
So historically, over 50 years, there's the nominal interest rate and the inflation rate. Fairly close relationship between those. So, to clarify, the Fisher effect and the inflation tax, inflation tax deals with your money, not your wealth. Somebody explain to me that distinction. We've been over it before. I want to make sure you remember. What's the distinction between money and wealth?
Isn't wealth like everything including assets? Investment?
Right, your other
Like your
assets
whole
beyond
portfolio.
money. Yeah, it's your home, your car, your investments, your vacation home, whatever child slaves you may have chained up in the basements.
Those count?
Well, not for taxation purposes, but
Ah.
they're part of your wealth.
That makes sense.
What's the equivalency of one slave to a dollar?
Depends upon your willingness to go to prison. Alright. So, according to the Fisher effect, then an increase in inflation causes an equal increase in the nominal interest rate, but the real interest rate, the rate that your wealth is interested in, remains unchanged. So the inflation tax only affects your money, only affects your currency, it doesn't affect your wealth. Because your wealth is not held in currency. The value of your house doesn't change, but the purchasing power of your dollar changed. This is why the inflation tax isn't something that gets talked about a lot, because most people don't have a lot of currency. Make sense? If people considered that when they buy on credit, they are essentially spending dollars, they should be interested in the inflation tax. They don't think about it that way. All right. People think inflation erodes their real income. But we know that real income is based upon the real interest rate, not the nominal. And inflation comes off of the nominal and gives you real. Inflation affects both sides of the graph. It affects supply and demand. So although you're paying more for what you buy, inflation should be affecting what you sell. And the largest thing that most people have that they sell is their labor. In the long run, your income is based upon real things, real variables, not the real interest rate. Or not the inflation rate, sorry. You throw inflation out of it. Where it becomes an issue is if your real income doesn't grow. What am I saying there? If inflation last year was 2% and your income grew by 1%. If inflation was 3%, your inflation grew by 2%, then you're hurting. But theoretically, it applies across both sides of the graph. So CPI over here, that judges or gives us inflation, right? Nominal wages over here,
Where's your
it's the nominal hourly wage.
What do you need a screwdriver?
Phillips or regular?
Phillips. Okay.
Or you can take the ratchet. Here, you want the tips? Thanks, Dan. Did quite a number on it, huh? Did quite a number on it, huh?
Yeah, it's in there far.
It's sharp as hell.
You wanna take that off?
No way.
Or what is number 4? Number 4. What do you think?
Thanks.
We're not talking in here, I swear, about you.
Oh, yeah.
Nice, they broke your TV.
Grace bent it first. I'm sure. It was twisted a little and bent.
And then they broke it in the key.
Phrasing.
In the lock, yeah.
So
Do
phrasing.
you have compressed air? Like one of those like air
It's not a
ventilators?
double-sided.
Oh.
None of these are double-sided.
I've done that.
Oh,
at
it's
house.
like-
No,
It's
it's
like, okay, with that, but
You have to
I
take
just
the
want to
one
lock
off.
holes.
Yeah, we had to replace
Are we
the
still
door.
doing
I
racial?
did it yesterday.
So-
It's an Archer reference.
Which is which? Nominal wage is the purple. So nominal wage in the last 10 years of this graph has exceeded inflation. It varies back and forth. Some years it moves in lockstep. But overall, they move together, don't they? So, as a whole, we can say that wages have risen with inflation. What do we know in the micro view of things? That some wages have risen like this rapidly, and some have failed to keep up with inflation, because this is an average. And if a few rise a lot, you can throw off the average, right? Okay. So there are other costs of inflation beyond the lost spending power, the lost purchasing power. What we call shoe leather costs. That's when we waste resources. Now, why do they call it shoe leather? Because, boys and girls, before the age of sneakers, we all wore leather dress shoes, leather shoes. And even the soles were made of leather. They were made of hardened leather. Before we had rubber, you had hardened leather. And so as you walked, you wore off your shoe leather and you had to have your shoes resoled at the cobbler. So it's a shoe leather cost. So,
How do you
Barefoot.
How you bought that?
so what happens is if you are, this would translate today to you sit down with the grocery store ads. Anybody know what day the ads come out?
Wednesday.
On Wednesday, you sit down with the grocery store ads, and stores now, most of the time, if you take someone else's ad, they'll price match. They didn't used to do that.
No, most
So
stores
you
don't do
would-
that anymore.
They don't
Walmart
anymore?
stopped. There's
Walmart
not-
stopped, but now they give you a card, and every time that you, instead of price matching, they give you that number of money on a card, and you just keep adding.
Will you like scan it on the app?
Yeah.
So anyway, used to be you'd have to sit down because you didn't get them on an app on your phone. You'd sit down with all of the ads and you'd figure out, okay, I'm going to Baker's and I'm getting these 6 items, and then I'm going to Hy-Vee and I'm getting these, and I'm going to Food for Less and getting these. And the modern day equivalent of those shoe leather costs would be tire rubber and gas costs for that extra driving distance and the time spent doing that to save that extra money. Okay?